Okay, so thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to come here and speak. Much of what I want to say, I think, is going to be complementary to what Steve has said, where Steve has emphasized the ecological aspects of complex systems and how they can be governed. I'm going to do kind of the reverse. I'm going to give short shrift to certain technical engineering, ecological aspects, and look more at kind of the social science behind these governance problems. But in particular, I wanted to maybe just, before I get into my formal talk, I wanted to just mention a couple things, given the kinds of questions that Steve got. If I put on my hat as a social scientist, well, let me just step back and say, for about 15 years, I worked in Washington at what's called a think tank, which really, for those of you who have not been around that environment much, is really a non-governmental institution, so it's kind of an NGO, but geared toward providing, suggestions to government for how it can run better. So Brookings the Brookings Institution is a independent think tank in Washington with funding that has nothing to do with the government, so it can act autonomously. And after being there for 15 years, it is the case that you can develop a slightly jaded perspective on what policy is and how policy functions. And in particular, I think it was the case that the few of us there who were doing a little bit more basic research, we came to really see that much of really what passes today is kind of policy, let's say, talk by policymakers in the U.S. at least, oftentimes can be characterized in the following kind of one sentence, almost a joke because it's so simple. It's going to be that basically, what a policymaker says to you, says to the audience, says to the media is, do the right thing. Right? They say we should have the appropriate level of government debt, as opposed to the inappropriate level. Right? We should have the right amount, just the right amount of unemployment insurance, not higher, not lower. They don't tell you what the right amount is. They just say it should be the right amount, right? So to a first approximation, you can say, well, what policymakers really do is they rely on experts to tell them what the right numbers are, and they simply say, do the right thing. Now, from that perspective, I'd like to just, I invite you to think about the things I'm going to say now from a perspective which is a little bit different than what Steve gave, which is Steve was very clear that with the Green Revolution and other things, it has been the case that it's been scientists, engineers, even some kind of policy, I'll characterize them as policy want type people, have oftentimes done the following vis-a-vis policy. They've said, look, we're going to provide you policymakers with the solution, it's green crops, or maybe even a menu of solutions. And now you, the policymaker, your job is to figure out what the right answer is. Which is the right decision? How will our country go? And this is a certain kind of framing of public policy. Now, I'll say that my PhD on it actually says public policy on it. So I have a strong sense of, I think, of what this, we maybe call this kind of like at least in the U.S., we might call this kind of a Nelson Rockefeller sense of public policy versus there was before that there was something called public administration. In fact, a man I worked with in graduate school named Herbert Simon, who had a Nobel Prize in economics, his degree actually was in public administration, which is a term that's out of favor now for some reason. Talk about public policy. But so let me just say that I'm going to talk today about thinking about governance as a multi-agent system that is composed of many different agents all doing things that they all what's best for themselves. So it invites the following, I think, different interpretation. That interpretation is that we as social scientists, I'm a social scientist. If you're a social scientist, you may want to view a policymaker as the object of study. They are the specimens that we engage with. They are the things that we analyze. Steve analyzes water temples and rice paddies and the anthropology behind the people who create those things. As a public policy specialist, especially someone working in Washington, I think I've just lost the mic, one of the main domains of study is, in fact, politicians. And so, anyways, what I'm going to talk about today has the flavor of, at least it can be interpreted in the following sense. We want to basically put the politicians in the model. I'm not really going to be about just saying, here's a menu of options, and you can pick the option and you policymaker. And you say, without the policymaker in the model, you have a poor model. All right? So that's going to be one take-home message. As mentioned, I spend most of my time at George Mason University. Next year, I'll be on leave at Oxford, and there's a group of people there who are thinking about this way, thinking about governance and economics from this perspective. So Okay, so hopefully this will work. Okay, so what I'll talk about today in the next half hour or so is the idea that we're going to treat governance systems as multiple agent entities. That is, we're going to model the many different human beings, many different actors that are in these systems. I'll just very quickly go through some empirical literature. I'm going to apologize in advance. This is a slightly academic talk for that. Many of you are not academics, but it's going to just give you some connections to what exists in the literature. And then I'm going to talk about an explicit way that we use complex systems ideas through an agent-based computing approach. Now, since agent-based computing is what I do for a living, so this is kind of going to be an overview of research that my research group has accomplished. And the overall kind of big picture here, maybe one take-home message or one kind of summary way to think about this is that how can we evolve? How can we use complex systems tools to evolve better governance structures? And that's going to be something that comes out of here. Now, happily, I think between the first talk by Mr. Ho and now Steve's talk, I can go quickly through some of this terminology, which may be novel for some of you. The idea of emergence. Here, I'm going to really mean this in a very kind of very specific way, that we're going to really think about kind of what does the macroscopic level look like when individual agents, individual people are doing certain things. Okay, now there can emerge different kinds of macroscopic properties depending on what the individual agents are doing, but also based on the history of the system. And we'll see how that arises. Now, agent-based computing is simply a way to study these kinds of emergent phenomenon by basically representing the individual agents and then having the computer march through how the rules play out and seeing what emerges. So in this sense, we use, in the words of at Santa Fe, Steve and I had a colleague, a very fertile mind, Chris Langston. He called this agent modeling as a macroscope. That is, it's a way to go from the micro level to the macro. And you can, you couldn't see the rings of Saturn without a telescope. It turns out, and the human eye can't see those, but you can with a telescope. Certain kinds of social macroscopic properties can't be seen without some kind of large-scale rapid simulation approach. This is, I think, the novelty of this. This is where computing, as Jan has mentioned, really helps make progress here. What we're going to see, and kind of following on what Steve has described as non-equilibrium, we're going to see models where there's perpetual adjustment and adaptation at the local level, yet there can be macroscopic stationarity. The macroscopic system can be in quasi-steady state, but the microscopic level is always adjusting, adapting, evolving. And then in this context, then self-governance becomes how can the system itself structure its operation such that it is robust, resilient, et cetera, et cetera. How can the individuals who are participating organize themselves? I'm going to see examples of this as I go through here. Now, here's where I want to use a word of American English, which my experience is it does not always go well beyond North America. It is the idea of a social norm or a convention, something like when a bunch of agents are doing something in a similar way, they're coordinated. We have a convention. It's conventional to drive on the right side of the road in America, to drive on the left side of the road in England. That's a social norm. Now, it is the case often, it's the case in social science research in some quarters, that we will equate the idea of a social norm or convention to an institution. There's some institutional structure, there's a constitutional structure, there's a governance structure that is the institution. Now, it is my experience that in some parts of the world, people think of institution more in a brick and mortar way. That is, they want to have a building, a parliament, a Congress, and they want to have some kind of a physical structure which supports the institution. So I'm not sure how this will sound to your ears, but I'm going to use these words more or less synonymously today: social norm, convention, institution. And then what we're really talking about in kind of the big picture in a way that has not existed before is a computational version of political economy where we're going to have individual agents represented. These can be the people who are influenced, who are in the environment in question, or they can be the policymakers, as I mentioned at the start. In general, they're going to be very heterogeneous. They're not going to be infinitely smart, as was discussed earlier this morning. They're going to be boundedly rational. They're going to have departures from full rationality. They're going to interact directly with one another. So now we're going to be in the world of methodological individualism. So those of you who remember your Economics 101, this should sound familiar. But one thing that's going to be different from what we do with this kind of approach versus normal economics is in normal economics, it's a funny thing that in economics we say we'll represent the individuals. But then how do the individuals act? Well, they interact autonomously without regard for other individuals. Right? The only thing they look at is things like price vectors and interest rates, global variables. They don't actually interact with each other. And in fact, in game theory, it's, we even know what is it? What do we call it when agents talk to each other ahead of playing the game? Some of you who remember your game theory class, it's thought that all talk that doesn't modify the payoffs is inconsequential, so it's called cheap talk. It doesn't matter. So basically, agents don't even interact directly in regular economic models, but they are going to interact in our models. And as Steve described, out of equilibrium is very important. We'll see that as we go through here. So the kind of approach I'll get to eventually for the methodology of complex systems is we're going to basically just build up some of these software agents, drop them down into some economic environment, and see what they do. Let them interact, spin forward in time, what emerges. And then we'll look at some output statistics. Now, the way this works for any particular social phenomenon, in the case of Steve described models of this type for the case of the water temples, you build models that are situated where the agents are doing, water temple-like things, and you see how they interact. I'm going to describe today ways in which agents can be used to model the self-governance emergence in other kinds of systems besides the ones that Steve has described. Okay, so the overall goal, the big picture here is, can we get agents basically to govern themselves? Can they spontaneously figure out how they're going to do this? Now, this could be the case of markets. Well, laissez-faire markets actually have rules, and anybody who doesn't believe that, it turns out that the rules for the New York Stock Exchange are several hundred pages long. You have to trade in those particular ways. Even free markets have lots of rules. We will build models of economies in which there are firms, and then we'll also build models which we want things like, for example, the Federal Reserve Board to be part of the model, so we'll have to have governance in there. What is very easy to do today is to model 1 million agents. In fact, on this little machine I have here, I can run 1 million agent models in a matter of seconds. What is emerging today is newly feasible, and what I spend most of my waking hours doing these days, really in my research, is building very large-scale models of full economies. So, in fact, the work we'll be doing at Oxford next year is basically trying to reproduce what happened in the financial crisis using models that are one-to-one with the actual financial crisis. That is, there are 120 million workers in America, and we'll try to build models with 120 million actual, people receiving wages from companies. What I'm going to talk about today, though, is how can we get, in these large-scale models, how can we get multi-agent institutions to form spontaneously? And it's hard to do this, and we're at the very early time of knowing how to do this. And I think it's an open research question is how to do this properly. I'm going to give you some kind of preliminary and kind of early on results, but we have a lot to learn for how to do this properly. When we can't get it to happen, for example, in all my models, I can never get the Federal Reserve Board to emerge spontaneously. So we have to build in the Federal Reserve Board. I would love to know how to get that to happen. So this is the kind of thing that remains a research question. Okay, so when it comes to governance institutions, let's take a very specific example that I'll work with for most of my talk, just to be concrete about it. And the specific example is Garrett Hardin's famous framing of the commons, in particular the tragedy of the commons, so-called, right? Where there's imagine some common grazing land, some common pasture land. Nobody has any property rights to that. So every farmer, every herder can put their animals onto that cropland. And Hardin says, well, there's two important problems to that, or the important problem in that environment is that, in general, people will put too many cows on the pasture land in general. So there are two solutions which Hardin describes in his famous paper in Science from '68. One of them basically says, look, a firm could actually run the commons more efficiently, could run the pasture land more efficiently than this open property rights system where nobody has any property rights. So basically privatize the firm. Okay, that's one solution. And then how can you get, one immediate question is basically going to be, if in fact you privatize the community pasture land, what happens to those people who were using it before? How do they get compensated? That's an open question. We'll talk more about that in a minute. The other solution that Hardin mentioned is, let's nationalize the pasture. Let's basically make it communal property and have government now run this from the top down. And now there are, it turns out, well-known reasons why we have states. We have states to keep barbarians at our borders, and we have states to promote economic efficiency. It's not obvious that states know very much about how to run commons, how to run pasture land. And I'm going to describe some examples where the state has not done a very good job on these in these domains. The main message I want to talk about today, though, is that both of these classical solutions that Hardin described, they have these difficult problems, and in general, they can be outperformed by things more akin to what Steve has described today, things in which we have self-governance, that is, in which instead of turning over the property to the firm, to a firm, or instead of nationalizing it, what if we have the people who are using the resource figure out how to run it themselves? Now, many times it does not work, but there are well-known examples of where it does work. For example, Steve described that once a month there are meetings at the water temples. Well, for every Thursday, for the last 600 and some years, in Valencia, Spain, all of the farmers there who use this Huerta irrigation have met outside one Catholic church. Through Francisco Franco and through world wars and through the Inquisition, they still met every Thursday, and they figured out how they're going to divert the weirs to give water to people to make that whole thing work. And so here's an example of a long-standing, many hundred-year-old institution for managing irrigation in this one particular region of Spain. There are even longer-lived institutions in Switzerland and Japan for extracting firewood from forests without denuding those forests of firewood. In particular, in these places that are mentioned here on the screen, there are institutions that have lived for almost 1,000 years, and they've actually survived through things like through drought and famine, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll describe in a minute what are some features of these things. It's also the case, and a little closer to home perhaps here, and that in post-World War II Nepal, when Nepal got its independence, there's a great example here, I think, of a very clear example of what's wrong with Hardin's initial solution. So there's a lot of details we can go into. I'm going to just kind of paint with a coarse brush here and say, to a first approximation, what happened with Nepalese forests is as follows. Post-independence, the government decided to nationalize a bunch of forests. Okay, it also, under pressure from the West, from the World Bank, et cetera, decided to turn some of the forests over to private companies, basically to make it commercial forests. And as all of you know about Nepal, it's a very formidable terrain. But roughly 1/3 of Nepalese forests, in fact, were just left in private community hands, basically because they were just impossible to get big rigs in there to forest them or whatever. Just very hard country to navigate. Well, once again, painting with a coarse brush here, there's the summary of Nepalese forests, and some of you may know a lot more about this than I do. I know about this reading the histories, but is that today, in the wake of these management schemes for Nepalese forests, 2/3 of the Nepalese forests disappeared. The ones that were nationalized, the ones that were turned over to commercial vendors. The only forests that survived were the ones under self-governance, the ones that were run by local municipalities, by local tribes and local jurisdictions. And so the lesson here is that Hardin's two solutions are, in fact, not the only way to think about these problems of growing governance. The leading writer on this topic, at least from the point of view of economics and Western political science, is Lin Ostrom, who passed away recently, but who was awarded the Nobel Prize a couple years ago, even though a political scientist, the Nobel Prize in economics, or as our colleague at Santa Fe oftentimes says, the Swedish Bank Prize for economics. So Professor Ostrom studied these things as so-called common pool resources. The fact that these kinds of institutions, as I've described for Japan and Spain, they are not uncommon. They are occasionally long-lived, but they're oftentimes very fragile. They can be overturned with maybe not so resilient. But those that are successful are characterized by very clear boundary rules for determining who has access to the common. Think fishery, think open water, think those kinds of things. There are rules for governing who gets what in these systems, very, very clear rules. And they're active, this is very important too, they're active forms of monitoring. So for example, one of the great ways this plays out, although in a very passive-aggressive way maybe, when I think about it, in Japan is, when people gather firewood in these small mountain villages in Japan, you're required to display the quantity of firewood in front of your house. You have a firewood bin in front of your house, and people can see how much firewood you've collected. And that limits how much you will collect. Now, it is the case that game theorists have often said there should be a lot of things present in these institutions that have the following character. It should be something like, if in fact you have one stick too many in your Japanese firewood bin, you should be exiled from the village forever. Well, in fact, that doesn't happen. I mean, you don't have such draconian things in practice. You have perhaps the threat of these things, but you never have these so-called grim trigger strategies in reality. So it turns out pure game theory is just not that useful in thinking about why these institutions are the way they are. What I want to do now is just to give you a sense that there is some science behind complexity science. It's not just all talk. I'm going to actually go through a little bit of technical stuff, and I apologize in advance if you haven't done your economics in 10 or 20 years, you don't remember this stuff. But here are just some formal results. We'll go through this quickly. It turns out that we mentioned that you can privatize the commons, but already in 74, Weizmann proved that if in fact there's no side payment made to those people who are using the common, then in fact it's not a Pareto optimal thing to do. That is, imagine that all of us in here have access to some 100-hectare commons. We're all putting our cows out there, and suddenly the government says, well, it's better to just turn this over to a large firm to run the commons. Well, in fact, it could be more efficient in the long run for the firm to run the commons, but unless all of us are compensated somehow for the loss of the commons, then in fact it's not going to be, I've written here, a Nash equilibrium. So Nash equilibrium really just means that everyone doing what's best for themselves leads to the tragedy of the commons, so-called. So we can't actually do better unless these side payments are made. Now, these side payments, in fact, are rarely made, so this is a potential problem. John Romer is a political economist, a theorist at Yale, and he proved this result about 20 years ago now, that there are, in fact, 4 technical ways in which we can think about having solutions that are actually better than the tragedy of the commons. But it turns out, I'm going to go quickly here, these solutions, and I can give you references a little later on, although these will be in the talk in the slides online, that these solutions actually can't be designed to have everybody, kind of pursue what's best for themselves, and you end up in a good result. That is, the overall theorem that Romer proved is that there is no efficient mechanism that is going to outperform the tragedy solution that can be implemented as a Nash equilibrium. That is, there's no mechanism that exists that the government can announce, we're going to have this new kind of, incentive system. All of you guys are using the commons, but you're over-exploiting it. Now, can we design a new mechanism such that we all follow those new rules and we're all made better off? And the answer is no. That mechanism does not exist mathematically. No, unfortunately. Now, it turns out this was a very specific result applied to the tragedy of the commons. It turns out today we know more. Today that it's widely known that there are a variety of theorems which have the basic flavor that mechanism design is hard in for many different kinds of problems, and this is one area where it is hard. And so I can go into more details later, or maybe in the question and answer period. Okay, so what I'm going to do here next is say we can't expect to have a beautifully kind of mathematically pure solution to the tragedy of the commons. So can we develop something which is going to be kind of a better result than this kind of common ownership problem where we all put too many cows on? 2 minutes, okay. So basically, it turns out we can build a mathematical model of that, and I'm not going to go through the details unless there's questions about that later on. And what we end up with is that we can get a tragedy of the commons to exist. Basically, this just shows that as people in the environment work harder, then we're going to get more effort coming. It's better for you to put more cows on the environment. And this is just a technical way to say this in economics, that basically when people are doing what's best for themselves, they put too many cows in the environment, and when they do what's best for society, they put fewer. So that's just a technical way to say this. So we can invent systems, we can basically invent, using agent computing, we can invent algorithms then that produce good results. And this is just one particular algorithm. I won't go through the details with the limited time I have today. But just to give an example of how this works is that we can say, here are 3 quick examples where we can showing you what happens. And the first example is that the black line refers to the Nash level, where everybody is doing what's best for themselves. And notice it has high. I think the effort level is the number of cows on the environment. So a lot of cows in the environment produces black line low utility. Versus if a social planner were to figure out how many, or if a firm were to figure out how many cows put on in the past, they would put fewer cows and they would get higher utility for everybody there. But what the red line is here is how our decentralized algorithm, agents pursuing their own ends, can produce something which is in between either the perfect outcome or the bad outcome. Now it turns out we can interpret this thing as basically when people monitor each other, they basically end up in a situation where we can have these results that are better than the bad outcome, not quite as good as the perfect outcome. Now, one thing that emerges from this is now an example with heterogeneous agents, where the agents are ranked. There are 10 agents here on the commons. They're ranked basically from how much they have preferences for how much they like the the milk that comes off the commons or the production of the commons. And one of the results that falls out here naturally is that, I'm trying not to bump anything, but is that basically it's those agents who are the most rapacious who are naturally limited in their in what they can do on the commons. When that happens, you can get high levels of utility, high levels of performance from the overall commons by limiting those who want to be the most rapacious. Anyways, make a long story, and that produces a different kind of monitoring network, as you can see here. I want to end, though, with a couple concrete applications, and one of them is one that some of you in the room will know about. So for about 5 years, I worked on a model of the so-called American Anasazi. These were a group of people who lived, a group of Native Americans who lived pre-Columbian, in the American Southwest. They basically grew corn, but they grew corn in a very marginal climate, 8 or 9,000 feet above sea level, and in basically a desert type environment. So it was very hard to survive here. And in fact, there was a sudden, even though they lived here for a long period of time, there was a sudden demise in the year 1300. So we built a model of this, and using many of the ideas of these kinds of commons, there's a fixed amount of land you can plant corn on, and how did they allocate that? So just say, here's a paper on this process that came out of in PNAS, and there was an article by Jared Diamond on this in Science. So this is an example where the population would eventually grow and collapse. The last example I wanted to mention is that another example is we have a new model just up and running now of so-called Easter Island. So Rapa Nui in the anthropology in terms of what it's called by the Native Americans. So in this particular model, just to show quickly, this particular model, we have the natural landscape. We have, of course, the famous statuary Easter Island. But we have this kind of high-fidelity, full-scale model of the entire island. And using this model and using ideas of, this is a case where when the Polynesians landed here, there were great stands of palm trees. And with those palms, they built boats. And with those boats, they harvested tuna. But then it's a relatively small island. And by the time they had denuded the island of all the palm, they can no longer fish for large tuna and other large fish. They end up going through a resource crisis. And at that point, things became quite violent on the island and led to the emergence of tribes that were quite combative. Anyways, to make a long story short, if you can study the spontaneous formation of this thing, of these kinds of things, using computing, using agent modeling, and then my summary simply is going to be that there are these competing views of governance, top-down, bottom-up. Self-governance is really the language of complex systems. And we can use these ideas to build solutions to tragedy, the commons problems. We can apply these today in real-world situations. And Mr. Ho talked about prediction versus explanation. Oftentimes, it's hard to do literal prediction with these models because they depend on history. They depend on lots of contingent things. But what we can do for sure is we can build models that have to give us better explanations for why things happen the way they do. And that can be very useful in and of itself. Thank you.
Questions, remarks? Yeah, there I see a hand. Please.
I promise you this is my last question.
Why?
For the day. No, I mean, there are more people, so. Thank you for your nice talk. And I just want to mention you some things that you mentioned but didn't go deeply. There's a paper by Carl Schell, he was the editor of Journal of Economic Theory, and Pliska. Schell and Pliska is this series of social choice papers where they show that the problems that has pure coordination aspects, endogenous coordination devices are more stable and sustained for long. But the question, wherever there is a conflict between the parties involved, so your dollar means my dollar loss. So, not necessarily zero-sum game, but, some level of conflicts. Then external mechanism at times works better than, this kind of internally developed what you are calling self-governance. So economists, it's not that they miss this problem. It's just that they know that it's a too difficult problem to get into. So, they give these inclinations of these nice equilibrium results, but really didn't pursue too far there because I think it's that. I'm asking him, I'm making you aware that some of these problems have already been pointed out in it, that which Subaks can solve.
Defending the economists. Mm-hmm. So please react on that. He's saying we economists saw already these problems,
No, I'm not saying we solved already. I'm saying, there is, when SUVAX can solve and when SUVAX cannot work, when, that has been kind of laid out in economics before.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I think that my main comment is to say that I think that at least when it comes to the tragedy of the commons, of course, this is a problem that's well worked in economics and it's very well understood. But it is the case today that it's almost always framed as privatize the commons, put property rights in to solve it, or nationalize the commons, put it under some kind of top-down control. Well, I just assert that we have almost no knowledge today of the full variety of self-governance institutions which might emerge. That is, there could be, my feeling is it's kind of like zoology, there can be thousands or millions of different flavors of self-governance institutions that can arise. If nothing else, when Lin Ostrom characterizes the many different kinds of institutions which are available just in the US for governing fresh water. That is, there's groundwater somewhere. There is a local community which governs how the groundwater is extracted, utilized, how much is used. There is such infinite variety just among those that I don't believe that we have any satisfactory theory whatsoever of how those things arise. Now, the main point is just that, yes, it's going to be the case that it's harder to manage these things in some cases versus others, and of course that's true.
Okay.
But we don't have as a theory of the institutional.
No, but there's quite a lot of ideology behind the first the option, nationalize it or make it in the private market.
I think it's fair to say. I think it's fair to say that most economists have not adopted a complex systems approach. Rather, they've said, look, the world is relatively simple. We're going to keep it relatively simple. We're going to say, if you solve for equilibrium, notice that a firm does very well on managing the commons. Well, you have to make the side payments to make that work out. Or they'll say, well, a different solution is just to have a social planner solve the problem from the top down, and you get a different class of answers. Social planner problem is a nationalized solution. But what we don't know today, we have almost no economic theory whatsoever for how we can have an institution of, say, 25, 50, 100, 10,000 people co-produce an institution which self-governs that particular resource. We don't have that theory.
Okay, please.
Hi, Doug Carmichael from INET. I think looking forward to the possibility of self-governing solutions is terrific, but as I heard your paper, your presentation, you're overlooking that the commons that existed, say by 1500, had a culture of self-management that actually worked pretty well. And it was the pressure from aristocrats on the land that destroyed the commons, not the farmers themselves.
Oh yeah, I'm not making any point about historical commons. I'm just saying there are a wide variety of resource problems today that are basic commons problems, right? There are a few 100 million gallons of fresh water below some town in Indiana. The community owns it. How do you manage it? That's a commons problem. That has nothing to do with the English common laws or something.
Okay, yes, please.
So I have
Your
a
name,
feeling
please.
that we
Yes, Peter, how are you?
sorry, I'm Peter Sloot from University of Amsterdam in the complexity program, NTU. I have a feeling that we are simplifying things too much. So as well as in the talk by Stephen, in your talk, it seems that you're looking for a set of rules that somehow can guide the process into, like in your case, from one stable point to another stable point. But the two examples that you both were given about this self-confidence concept actually is that the individuals there, they constantly adapt to the rules that they have defined themselves. I think that's one of the strong things. It's not they don't just apply rules, but they dynamically change the rules. And so I think we're still looking at things too much in isolation. The reason why they have to adapt to change the rules is because they are not in isolation. They are connected to all kinds of other things. So my question to you would be, can we kind of incorporate this notion of evolution of rules in the kind of models that you were talking about, that they would make sense? Because even though you can observe these two, single attractors that Steve was seeing, I actually believe that that's just a snapshot in time. These things will change over time.
Okay.
So it actually turns out that if you read Ostrom in particular, so she has whole chapters about this, Peter. So basically, so the idea that she wants to talk about meta rules, and then the question becomes, there's a little bit of a public goods problem associated with who makes the meta rules. In fact, nobody makes them. They're simply responses to drought or famine or something, right? People respond. But we should also differentiate though the idea of there can be more or less static rules for wide blocks of time, yet changing microscopic structure. That is, it may be the case that your father has had the land for a long time. Your father now passes away. The rules come to you, or the land comes to you. It has to be a slightly different set of rules for you versus your father. So even though there's a slightly different instantiation of the rules for you versus your father, even though it's the same rules. So there's a question of what is a rule, what's a meta rule. This is an important question in this thing, but of course they evolve. I will say though, from reading Ostrom, she's very clear on this. She tracks 1,000 years.
He said in your presentation and the previous one that you had not brought in enough complexity because you did not give attention to the rule dynamics.
Right.
And now you're saying, no.
Well, let me just say, I think there's a technical way to say this beyond scope of our current audience, is that there is a formal theory in game theory. There's a formal theory of perturbed games, stochastically perturbed games. We're going to bounce around between different configurations of the space. And so that's the way we model evolution, as basically kind of a random process driven by noise. So there's a formal way to deal with it.
Please, yes, and that's the last question. Go ahead.
I have a I don't even need it. Oh, okay. Very simple question.
What's your question? Your name?
I'm Peter Bratton. Yeah. How do you communicate this to the policymakers you described earlier? And yeah, I guess I'll stop there.
Okay, so I want to.
No, let's say.
How do you work with?
I'm going to rephrase it a little bit. You're on a reception with the minister, and he said, the minister is coming to you and saying, I heard about the beautiful work you're doing, and I have some local problems there, and I want to have that they solve themselves. I think it's possible that they can solve themselves these problems, and they make a community. And I'm not an ideologist, I'm not of the market, and I think that's possible. Please, how to do it?
I want to answer the question with a short joke and say that Jack Goldstone, the physicist at Chicago, eminent physicist, once said that he got a call from his phone rang suddenly in his office, and he got a call from a rich donor. It turns out a rich alumni to Chicago, and then the donor said, who am I talking with? And he says, well, this is Professor Goldstone. And then she said, well, I want to talk with nobody lower than a dean. And his reaction was, there's nobody lower than a dean. Right? So the point is that it may be the case that if a policymaker comes to me, I will task one of my subordinates with the issue of dealing with the policymaker in the following sense, that I want to build policymakers into the model. And that has probably not come across that much here.
They're not monkeys.
No, they're agents, though. They're agents. So I want to have, in fact, it turns out there actually is terminology for this already. So in fact, the Dutch are very good on this. Within the Dutch, there's a project recently from the Dutch called FIRMA, Freshwater Management or something, in which they actually have the policymakers are agents in the system, and then they call this participatory simulation. And this is a very hot topic right now in what I do, where you actually basically you have the policymaker play a role in the model itself. Instead of taking the answer to the policymaker and saying, pick A, B, or C off the menu, you say, here's a joystick. You now play the model and see how you're going to do. Yeah. This is the answer.
Yeah, okay. Last question there. Then.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I just
Your name?
My name is Zhongwen. I'm from the Urban Redevelopment Authority. I sort of have three questions, and it relates. Sorry? Three questions. Very simple questions.
Simple and simple answers too.
I hope so. I think the first question is relating to what you shared about an agent-based model. I think that there are some critics, including I think Dave Snowden, who sort of asked the question of whether an agent-based approach, which has been used a lot in biology and looking at how molecules and animals interact to see the emergent patterns, whether that is directly applicable in looking at social-economic issues. And
that's the first question.
Yeah, so that's the first question. I think part of that is also looking at saying that in terms of social economic issues, you see a lot of adaptive behaviors. What would be a good approach in terms of incorporating within an agent-based model consideration of these adaptive behaviors that happen? The second part, I think it's really also related to the first question, is saying that even within social science, whether is it in economics, in psychology, in sociology, there is a diversity of views of how a certain relationship actually happens. and there's no even common agreement whether that relationship is correct or wrong. How then do you incorporate this diversity of views into a model where you're trying to consider how socioeconomic patterns and relationships and interactions take place? And I think that the third question sort of also refers to Lansing's earlier.
Was this the second question then?
Yes, still this is the second question. Yes. So the third question is sort of relating to, I think, the Lansing's earlier presentation, which sort of showed that through simulation, you see an outcome happening which relates to the subak. And at least my very rudimentary understanding of complexity is saying that from a certain initial state, it could take place and transform over time into very different outcomes. But in that simulation earlier, you were saying that after 10 years, the outcome was similar to what you see today. What were the do we think that there will be other outcomes that could have happened? I mean, for example, in the subak case or in other cases, because I suppose that is what we refer to as complexity.
Okay.
Right. So it's 3 questions, but I can answer them all with one answer, I think. And the answer is going to be that basically, when it comes to agent-based modeling, when it comes to social science modeling, the only way today that we have to include the important things that you mentioned, adaptive behavior, heterogeneous understanding of how the world works, et cetera, the only way to put those things into formal models today is with agent-based computing, because we don't know how to do that mathematically. So agent computing is a natural way to do that. Now, it is the case, though, that Steve and I have been around for doing this stuff for only on the order of 15 or 20 years. The field is that young. The field's only been around. Chris Langton invented the field 20 years ago. And it's a very young field. There are lots of things that we don't know how to do properly in it. But I think that those people who can say, after only 20 years of development, that it is not the right way to do social science, those people are not scientists. That's a claim. That's not that's an assertion. That's not a theorem.
So your answer is then, he is asking 3 critical questions, and your answer is, don't be so critical now, come back over 20 years.
Fair enough. Yeah, fair enough.
That's it. That's the answer.
Yeah.
That's it, eh?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
okay. Okay, well, thank you very much for your presentation.